it takes a little bit longer. And I'm very sure that in 2 or 3 years, especially if he lays off the drugs, in 2 or 3 years or so, David Shayler will actually come to a realization that whilst he's had a very interesting experience, he's had a very interesting journey, he's not the Messiah.
Right.
And in Jerusalem, they actually have a unit in the Israeli police that's called the Messiah unit. Okay. Because on average, they have about 14 people a year who, they're visiting Jerusalem, and obviously they get caught up in the emotion, or they tap into the ether or whatever. They tap into something, obviously, while they're there. And they have this incredible urge to, in most cases, apparently, they take a sheet from the bedroom of the hotel where they're in, wrap themselves in the sheet, and they go out on the streets and, preach. I mean, it's classic. It's an absolute classic, and it's a stage in the journey.
Exactly. Sorry to interrupt you, but exactly, I think you're right, and it's important for people on the outside as well to be aware of that is a natural process, because, as you say, about the integration and so forth that Jung talks about, that's not too widely known. People don't know that's something that many people might go through sometimes when they're around 40 or whatever, around 30, or some people have different stages in their life or different ages, but I believe it's a natural thing, a very healthy process in one way, because it depends also a little bit, the reaction, so to speak, of how that plays out is dependent on how you've lived your life up until that point. Meaning that if you're, if you've been very strict or what have you, the other side might be flowing over, and you're becoming more, loose and soft, if you will, or vice versa. So it's just to mention it, it's important that people know that just because one have these kinds of experiences, that doesn't discredit you totally or make you nuts. I think that one needs to go into that process as well with 100% certainty and really live it, really be in it, to actually go through it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, let's understand, in the West, we have this absurd term called the midlife crisis. In the indigenous peoples, it's called the midlife opportunity.
Yes.
And in many of the indigenous peoples, you cannot be a candidate to be regarded as an elder unless you've been through this process. Mm. And when they see the first signs of it, which is apparently it's about the same as in the West. All of a sudden the guy starts to comb his hair differently, or dress differently, put on the tight leather trousers or whatever. But whatever, when they see the signs that, this is starting, that if you like, the Kundalini has been awakened, they have a place, and it's a cave, or it's a remote hut or whatever, and they make sure that the individual is, appropriately, supported, with food, with water, with the elders coming to visit him, and he's encouraged to embrace the experience.
Yes.
What do we do in the West? Give people Prozac or Xanax.
Yeah.
Or we say, in the Britain, it's like, come on, get yourself out of it. Keep a stiff upper lip, man. And then when you hear people say, I've beaten the midlife crisis, because, basically they're still doing what they've always been doing. They're still doing, a 9-to-5 job, and they're still caught up in the financial slavery. No, they didn't beat the midlife crisis. The midlife crisis beat them.
Yeah, there you go.
The challenge, the real challenge here, and unfortunately, of course, the Western society is all about shutting down that. In fact, in the presentation I gave at this year's Glastonbury, which was called The War on Terror, TERRA, The War on Earth, the subtitle was Bio-Spiritual Warfare. Because more and more people, and I think, Rick is a classic example, are having this, this awakening earlier and earlier in life. I mean, nearly 100 years ago, Rudolf Steiner wrote, he said, anybody who goes into this process before the age of 40 is not ready.
Right.
Now, he wrote that in 1908, or said that in a lecture in 1908. But that's not the case today. And I mean, I think there's no question in my mind that some of the children that are being born today are actually, being born into the world with a phenomenal level of awareness.
Yes.
And I mean, I see this in, you know, some of the children that, you know, my kids associate with. And I think our challenge as parents is to help them realize their full potential, you know, not to try and sort of shut them down because they're different.
Exactly. Yeah, I totally agree. It's horrible how we also have, as you said, we've suppressed the idea of you know, the midlife crisis as we call it up here, you know, in that regard, and definitely it's the other way around. This is something that is very unhealthy to suppress that. This should be encouraged and really so people can, you know, bloom out, so to speak, and come to their full potential. And I agree with you as well. I think that more and more, you know, younger people are going through this faster and faster. I mean, we could even look at this speed up process that is going on up towards, you know, 2012 or whatever we want to look, way beyond that, where information is accumulating, you know, knowledge is accumulating. There's more and more, and it's going faster and faster. So a consequence of that is that when people come to this earth and when we grow up, we're gonna realize things much faster. In one way, it's very kind of logical if you think about it, because the nature of how much we are, you know, how much we're involved with so early at the stages of our lives, so that you know, by the time you're, you know, 25 or 20 in some cases, or 30 at this point, you might have gone through as much as someone who, you know, did when they were 40 or 50, living, you know, 50 years ago or something like that, you know.
I think that's a very sound observation. And I mean, just to put some practicalities on this, you know, I mean, there are obviously now some very, very good books that, you know, I'm only going to sort of recommend a couple, but and obviously, you know, people can research it for themselves and go where they feel. I mean, obviously in the West we demonize drugs.
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
And you know, we also know that you know, the governments are actually probably definitely the largest suppliers of these drugs for reasons that we don't have time to go into right now.
The chemical compounds, at least, yes.
Particularly the chemical compounds, exactly, the synthetics. And there's no question that the synthetics have a far higher risk factor than the natural substances. You know, so if anybody is tempted to sort of go down the path of you know, the shamanic journey, then, you know, seriously consider what's available legally and naturally.
Yeah.
You know, because that is a far better route. And but of course, I mean, the big difference is that in the West we have no preparation within our culture for shamanic practices. And you know, one of the things that I will observe, Henrik, is that one of the things I'm absolutely convinced of in the course of my research is that the vast majority of people who supposedly die of a drug overdose do not die from the pharmacology. What they die from is fright. Now, which brings on a corollary. So, you know, basically it's the same effect perhaps as the pharmacology. But if we look at the evidence, the medical evidence that was conducted back in the 1920s, particularly with heroin, and even back then it was acknowledged that, you know, depending on the individual, depending on how much heroin they could be injected with or they could consume before it had any kind of effect on them whatsoever. But what was most significant was, you know, where it took them in terms of, you know, the